Hello and welcome back to Humanizer, where I'm converting the free and open source MakeHuman 3D character creator from Blender into Godot 4.2. So I was able to get the face bones attached to the base skeleton from Mixamo. So now you can see I've made a eyes blinking animation for demonstration. And I also made a laughing animation, so it's not the best, but you get the idea. You can animate the facial features now. So the head bones are from the default skeleton in MPFB, and you can see you've got the bones around the lips and under the jaw, and then the cheekbones and eyebrows and eyelids as well. So you can pretty much make any expression with these, although it's not set up with the inverse kinematics, so you do have to make the animations manually for now. And this still works with the Mixamo animations. So you can play the body and the face animations at the same time, as you can see, and they don't conflict. So you can make them blink. And you'll want to use an animation tree to manage all of your animations, but I just have 2 players for now. So I have not integrated this into the rest of the project yet. So the character creator menu and the closed demo and all of the generation scripts don't use this. I've just put it in its own folder, but I did add it to the repository so you can see that it's working until I've gotten it integrated into the rest of the project. So I'll put the link to the repository in the description, and then I'll show you how I got this to work. So initially I was looking into Rigify, which has a bunch of helpers around the mouth and eyes to set the facial expressions, and you can also set where the eyes are looking. So Rigify is a Blender plugin, and MakeHuman comes with a pre-generated rig. So I was hoping that I would be able to use this, but when I made the new human in Blender, and with the Rigify, you'll have to have the Rigify plugin installed, but then under rigging you can add the default Rigify rig or the rig with toes, but I don't think we need toes, so I'll just use the default. So the issue is it doesn't have all of the face bones that it needs, like around the eyes and the mouth. So you can only control like the jaw and the eye rotation with this. So in this example, you can see all of the bones that were available. So there's a bunch in the forehead and the cheeks and surrounding the eyes. So that's what the meta rig does, is create all those bones. But that's not available in the automatic make human rig. So, and if I add the default human armature, you can see that you can see all of the face bones that are supposed to be there. So I could manually map these bones to the face, which is what he's doing in this tutorial from MK Graphics, which is very time consuming and not repeatable consistently, so it will always be different, which would not be very good. So, but I can't just use any old skeleton because I need the vertex locations from the rig JSON. So all of the ones that are available through the plugin have the corresponding vertex positions for each bone. So when you change the shape keys, it can resize the skeleton. And so basically the make human face rig is not going to work until they update the default generated skeleton. So I decided to just use the default rig instead. So if I make a new human and apply the default no toes, so this is just the MPFB standard skeleton, and this does have much more control than the previous rig. So these are the bones that I showed you in Godot, and you can change it to pose mode to adjust any of the bones. So you can rotate like that. So you can position them in Blender if you want. But now the problem is if I try to import the Mixamo animations and snap it to the mesh, it says only Mixamo armatures are supported. So basically these skeletons have completely different bone names and positions, and even though they look similar, the computer can't automatically assign them. So I downloaded the Rococo plugin, which is supposed to retarget animations. And so first you'll want to set the Mixamo animation to the rest position, so it's in T-pose, and then the human rig also has a T-pose, but these actually aren't perfectly lined up. So you can see like the fingers are more bent in one than the other. So if I line that up a little bit better, it's almost correct. And now with Rococo, if I select the source rig, and then I want to apply it to the human mesh, and click build bone list, so it'll automatically populate some of these values. And I know some of them probably need to be changed, but if I just use the retarget animation, so I have watched some tutorials on making this work as well, and I know like this does take some manual input, but I have tried changing these mappings around, and I still really can't figure out how to get it to work. So right now you can see the legs are almost right, and the head looks okay, but the arms are folded through the body. So when we play our animation, of course, that doesn't work. So I don't know. If anyone has any tips for getting this to line up in a repeatable way where I can just automatically set it up, because then I'll need to import more animations, so I'll have to use this every single time I want to add more to the game. So I'm not going to use this, but I am open to suggestions. But then I found a video basically showing how to cut off the Rigify head and apply it to the Mixamo body. So it takes a lot of steps in Blender to do, but in Godot it's relatively simple to do it programmatically. So that's what I ended up doing, is just taking the face bones from the default rig and then creating a new skeleton and attaching them to the existing Mixamo body. First, in a new Blender project, I'll use the Make Human plugin MPFB2 to make a new human from scratch. And in the Data tab, I'll disable all of the shape keys. Then under Rigging, I'll add the default no toes and add the standard rig. So you can see it has all of the face bones now. Then I'll save this in the project. As a blend file. And then I'll just use Ctrl-Z to remove the previous rig, and I'll need a copy of the Mixamo rig as well with the import weights. So I'll add the Mixamo rig now, and now it no longer has the face bones. And I'll save this as a separate blend file in the project. Once it's done importing the assets in Godot, I'll make a new 3D scene for the rig hybrid, and I'll add the default no toes and Mixamo rig. And then you'll right click on the packed scene and make local. And then I can drag the skeleton and delete the parent nodes. So this is the default skeleton and the Mixamo skeleton. And you can see that the meshes are already attached to their skeleton, so I can move the leg and the face on the default skeleton, as you can see. And this works on the Mixamo skeleton as well. But of course they have different naming conventions, and so now I want to take the face bones from the default skeleton and add them to the Mixamo skeleton. First, I'll add a new skeleton 3D for the hybrid skeleton, and I'll attach a script to the scene, and I'll want this to be a tool since I'm working with skeletons and you can't see them in game. Then I'll make an export variable to refresh, and override the set function and call on refresh. So if I save this and reload, now when I toggle the refresh, it prints the build hybrid skeleton, so that's working. So now on refresh, I'll make a new variable for the hybrid skeleton, and I'll duplicate the Mixamo skeleton. Then I'll replace the hybrid skeleton node with the new Mixamo copy, and it will use a randomized name. So I just want to set the name of the node to hybrid skeleton. So now if I refresh, you can see that it's made a new copy of the Mixamo skeleton, and it has a copy of the mesh as well. And this is connected to the mesh. So to start out, I just want to add all of the bones past the head bone from the default skeleton. So since the Mixamo animations affect the Mixamo neck and head, I don't want to delete those bones or really override them. I just want to attach the entire default face to the Mixamo head bone. So I'll copy from the default head bone onto the Mixamo head bone, essentially, and that will keep the Mixamo animations intact. So here is the head bone, and I'll make a new function to add the face bones, and this will take a default bone ID from the default skeleton. So I'll get the bone name from the default skeleton, get bone name at the default bone ID, And then I just want to add the bone name to the hybrid skeleton for now. And in the refresh function, I'll get the default head ID equals default skeleton find bone, and then I'll call the add face bones from the default head ID. So now if I refresh this, it's moving the skeleton back on top because I'm making a new node. So I just need to set the transform. But for now, so it's just added the head bone. And I'll set the hybrid skeleton position equal to the current hybrid skeleton position. So, and then I want to loop over the child bone IDs in the default skeleton get bone children from the default bone ID, and I'll call the add face bones on the child bone ID as well. So now if I refresh this, the skeleton stays in place, and you can see that it's added all of the relevant face bones from the default skeleton into the Mixamo skeleton. However, they don't have any hierarchy, so now I need to add them to their parent. So basically, I'll need to pass the hybrid parent bone ID as well to the face bone function, and then when I loop over the child bones, I'll need to get the hybrid bone ID from the hybrid skeleton after I add the bone. Then I'll find the bone name to get the hybrid bone ID, and then I'll pass that in the add face bones, and I'll need to get the hybrid, the Mixamo head ID from the hybrid skeleton, and so this will be Mixamo rig underscore capital H head. And I'll pass that to the initial add face bones call. So now when I update the hybrid skeleton, I also need to now set the parent bone ID. So hybrid skeleton set parent from the hybrid bone ID to the hybrid parent bone ID. So now if I refresh, you can see that all of the additional face bones from the default rig have been added to the Mixamo head bone in the hybrid skeleton. And since they don't have a position set, you can't see them. They're all just grouped up on the head bone. So now I need to set the position and rotation. Now in the script, in the add face bones, I'll set the hybrid skeleton, set bone rest pose to the for the hybrid bone ID to the default skeleton, get bone rest of the default bone ID, so now if I refresh, you can see there are the face bones now, but they're still all clumped up. So if you go to Skeleton 3D, reset all bone poses, now the face bones snap to their positions. So after I add the face bones, I just need to call the hybrid skeleton reset bone poses function. So now when I refresh, the bones are all in the proper place. Now you can see though that they don't actually line up with the mesh, so they're a little bit low and forward and tilted back. So now I need to basically get the global transform of the face, the head bone, in the default skeleton, and then set the global transform of the head bone to the same place. So I'll need to get the local transform between the global head bone and the Mixamo head bone. So you can use the inverse transform by multiplying to get the position and rotation, but it'll be easier just to add temporary nodes and set their global position. So I'll go ahead and do that. So I'll add a new function to set the head transform, and I'll get the default skeleton head ID from the default skeleton find bone head, and I need the default head transform from the default skeleton get the global bone rest transform of the default skeleton head bone. Then I will also need the hybrid head bone ID so that I can set the transform on that bone. And I need the hybrid parent ID dot get bone parent of the hybrid head ID, which will be the hybrid skeleton Mixamo rig head. And finally, I need the hybrid parent transform from the hybrid skeleton get bone global rest of the hybrid parent ID. Then, instead of using the inverse transform to get the position and rotation, I'll just make a new node 3D for the parent node equals node 3D dot new, and I want to add the parent node to the scene first before setting the global transform equals the hybrid parent transform, and then I'll make another node for the head equals node 3D dot new, and I'll add this as a child of the parent node. And then I'll set the head node global transform equal to the default head transform. And now I can make a new variable equal to the head node local transform, and I don't want to have a bunch of extra nodes, so I'll remove the parent node from the scene, and finally set the hybrid skeleton bone rest for the hybrid head ID equal to the local transform, and I want to call this after I add the face bones but before I reset the bone poses. So if I save and refresh the scene, now the face bones snap to the mesh. So you can see that it's all lined up properly with the neck and the face. So at this point, if I move the body around, it still connects to the mesh. And the Mixamo head still turns the head, but none of the face bones are attached to the mesh, basically, since I just copied the mesh from the Mixamo rig. So now I need to merge the default and the Mixamo meshes. So first, I don't want to copy this mesh, so I'll just move the meshes up. So this is the default mesh, and this is the Mixamo So now if I regenerate this, and reload the scene, so now if I regenerate this, it doesn't create the extra mesh, and I'll want to add a new mesh instance, rename to the hybrid mesh, and then I'll set the skeleton to the hybrid skeleton. Now I do want to make a copy of the Mixamo mesh and set it for the hybrid mesh, since most of the vertices are connected to the body bones and only about 10 to 20% are attached to the head and shoulders. So I'll make a new onReady variable for the Mixamo surface arrays equals the Mixamo mesh.mesh.surface get arrays on surface 0. Then I'll add a new function to set the hybrid mesh, and this will, first I'll make a new surface arrays equal to the Mixamo surface arrays.duplicate. Then I'll make a new mesh equal to array mesh.new, and I'll use the add surface from arrays with primitive triangles and the new surface arrays. I won't worry about the blend shapes for now. And then I want to set the hybrid mesh.mesh equal to the new mesh, and I'll call the set hybrid mesh function after I set the head transform and after I reset the bone pose. So now if I refresh, I need to reload the scene first, because I added a new onReady. So now when I refresh, you can see that it made a new mesh, but it's not lined up with the skeleton. So I need to move it under the hybrid skeleton and reset the transform, and then separate it. So it is attached to the skeleton. If I move the hybrid skeleton, you can see that the mesh is attached. So now I just need to identify the vertices that are connected to the face bones. Now to get the bone weights, I'll need to get the default surface arrays as well. So I'll add a second onReady variable for the default mesh surface arrays, and then I'll need to compare the vertice weights to a subset of the head bone child bones. But first, so they would need to have the same size of bones and weights arrays, which means they would need to have the same number of vertices. And if I print the Mixamo vertex array dot size and the default surface array size. And reload the scene because I added the onReady variable. So you can see that the Mixamo mesh has 16.9 thousand vertices, and the default mesh has 18,000 vertices. And I don't really know why they would be different, because I used the same mesh, and they have the same UVs, but I did use the unique indexer, and they ended up with the same number of vertices, so I could reindex using that, but instead I'll use the surface tool to generate the normals and tangents, so that way it will be in the format that the final model will be in. And I already have the mesh shader class that I made last time, so this would shade any blend shapes as well, but we don't have any, so it'll just shade the base mesh. And I could probably just use the surface tool optimize indexes function instead, but I know for sure this will be the same order, so I'll just, since I already have a class for it, I'll call the mesh shader dot new from the Mixamo mesh, and then call the run so it returns the new mesh, and then get the surface arrays from that. And I'll do the same for the default mesh. So now if I reload the scene and refresh, you can see that they both of the default and the Mixamo mesh both have 14,517 vertices, so the bones and weights arrays will have the same number as well. And I did check with the vertex finder, the vertices do line up, so they're all in the same order. So now I can compare them to the head bone list. So first I need to make a new function to get all of the child bone IDs recursively. So there's already a get child bones, but it only works for one level, and I need to go down the entire tree. So this will take a bone ID and a skeleton, and then I'll make a new array for the child bone IDs, and this will have the current bone, so this is inclusive, and then I'll loop over the child bone IDs in the skeleton get bone children for the bone ID. And then I'll append the get child bone IDs on the child bone ID using append array. and finally return the bone IDs. Then, and this will take the skeleton as well. Then I'll add a new onReady variable for the default head bones equals get child bone IDs on the default skeleton, find head bone, and the default skeleton. So, and then I'll need to reload the scene for it to fill that array. So now it should have a list of all of the head bones that are attached, all of the face bones that are attached to the head in the default skeleton. So this one. So in the make hybrid mesh function, instead of trying to overwrite the bones and weights arrays, I'll just set them to an empty packed int32 for the bones and packed float32 for the weights. And it will be, it's just easier to append them than trying to replace arrays within another array. Then I want to loop over the number of vertices in the default surface arrays. And for now, I just want to append the Mixamo surface array at the bones, and then I'll just get the slice of 8, or so this will be slice of I times 8 to I plus 1 times 8. And this will be append array. And then I'll get the array weights as well. And I'll just refresh. So we need to get the vertex array size. So now if I refresh, it doesn't throw any errors, and the mesh is still attached to the skeleton, or it should be. So now you can see the mesh is still attached, so that's good. So now I want to make a function to check if the vertex is attached to the face. So I'll get the bone slice from the default surface arrays at the bones array, and then get the slice from the ID times 8 to ID plus 1 times 8. And then I'll loop over the IDs in bone slice, and if I is in the default head bones, then return true. Otherwise, return false. And now in the make hybrid mesh function, I'll check if the vertex is connected to the face, and if it is, I'll append an empty, I'll just set the bones and weights to 0 for now. So new packed int 32, and then fill it with 8 zeros. And then I'll append a float 32 for the weights. Otherwise, append the Mixamo bones and weights. So now, if I refresh, you can see that all of the head and shoulders vertexes have been unmapped from the skeleton. So it's just all of the body vertices are still intact, and it's still connected to the skeleton. So now I need to average the weights between the face, the default mesh, and the Mixamo mesh. And I'll be getting the bones and weight slices quite a bit, so I'll make a new function to get bone weight slice of the vertex ID, and then make a new variable out equals empty dictionary, and this will take a surface array as well. Then I'll set out dot bones equal to the surface arrays at bones slice, and then I'll set the weights and I'll return the new dictionary. So now I can set the Mixamo bone weights for the vertex ID on the Mixamo surface arrays, and then this will be mx bone weights dot bones, and this will be weights, and then in the face vertex I'll do the same thing, so but this will be for the default surface arrays. And then so now I'll just refresh to make sure that it doesn't throw any errors and the mesh still looks the same. Next, I want to make a function to retarget the face bones, and this will take the vertex ID. So again, I'll make a new empty dictionary for the out and return that. But this time I'll set the out.bones equal to the 0 array. And then here I'll get the retargeted for the ID. And then I can append the retarget bones and weights. So now, instead of setting this to an array of 8 zeros, I want to, while out.bones.size is less than 8, I want to append a 0 to the bones and the weights. So and then I'll get rid of the initial arrays, and I'll make a new variable for the default slice equals the get bone weight slice on the ID from the default surface arrays, and the Mixamo slice from the Mixamo arrays. So first, I just want to copy the default bones and weights into the output. So I'll loop over the default slice bones.size and then append the default bones to the bones array and the default weights to the weights output. And then I'll go ahead and print both of the bones and weights. So now if I run this, you can see that there's 2 arrays for each one. This has the bone IDs, which are integers, and the weights array has floats that add up to 1. So first I just want to remove the 0 weights so that I just have the ones that are being used. So I'll check if the default slice weights at I does not equal 0. Then append it to the output. So if I run this again, now you can see that the arrays have been reduced to just the weighted vertexes. Now the mesh generation doesn't work anymore because the mesh is referring to bones that aren't in the skeleton. So first, since I only have the default face bones, I want to remove the references to the other bones. So this will be the neck 1, 2, and 3, and the shoulders in some cases. So when I make sure the weight is not 0, I'll also check if the default slice bone at I is in the default head bones. So only add the bones that are from the default head and face bones, and this will ignore everything else. So if I run that again, now the arrays have been reduced even further. So next I want to convert the default bone IDs to the hybrid bone IDs, and you can just subtract, I think it's 25, but that's not a very reliable, since they're just appended at the end. But I would prefer to make an index, so I'll go ahead and do that. So I'll make a new empty dictionary for the default to hybrid face IDs. To index between them, and then when I add the face bones from the default to the hybrid, I'll get so I already have the default bone ID and the hybrid bone ID, so I'll just set the default hybrid bone index at the hybrid, or at the default bone ID equals the hybrid bone ID. And we're using a dictionary because I want it to keep its index. If you just used an array, it would automatically index. And now, instead of appending the default bone ID, I'll get the hybrid bone ID from the default to hybrid bone index at the default bones at I, and then I'll append the hybrid bone ID instead. And I'll have to reload the scene since I added the variable. And refresh. So now instead of 70 and 120, these are 52 and 108. And the mesh is visible again, so you can see the parts that map completely to the face, like the eyes and the nose and the mouth. Those are all connected, and so if I move the jaw, and reset the skeleton, so if I move the jaw, you can see that the mouth is opening. So that is partially working. Now I need to merge in the existing Mixamo vertex weights so that it doesn't melt through the neck. First, I need to get the total weight of the existing default weights. So I'll make a new variable for total weight equals 0, and then I'll assign the local weight with to the default slice, and I'll add the local weight to the total weight. Then I'll loop over the Mixamo weights dot size and get the local weight of Mixamo slice at weights at I. So again, we'll make sure that the local weight is not 0. Then multiply the local weight times 1 minus the total weight. And then I'll append the Mixamo bone ID, which will correspond to the hybrid skeleton and the local weight. So now if I run it again, it throws an error that the array size does not equal the bone count times the number, the bones, so times 8. And that's because now some of the slices have more than 8 bones since I appended the Mixamo. So I'll need to, while the bone size is greater than 8, I'll get the min weight index equals 0, then loop over the indexes in the bone size, and if the out bones at I is less than the out bones at the minimum size or min weight, then set the min weight equal to eye. And then once it's found the lowest weight, I want to remove the min weight from the, so this is the index, I want to remove it from the bones and the weights so they have the same number of vertexes. So now if I run this again, you can see that it doesn't throw the error, it just builds the skeleton. And now the mesh looks like the other two. And if I move the Mixamo bones, I do need to retarget the skeleton though. So now if I move the Mixamo bones, you can see the mesh is still attached. And now the default rig bones are attached as well. So I can open and close the jaw, and then under the eyes you can rotate the eyes, but I don't have the mesh. So, but you can also open and close the eyes. So if you can see on the left side, the eyelid is opening and closing. And then we have the eyebrows and cheekbones, and you can make them smile as well using the bones around the mouth. Now to demonstrate the Mixamo animations, I'll make a new character body 3D, and I'll copy the hybrid skeleton and hybrid mesh that I generated into the scene, save this in the hybrid rig, and then if I open up the skeleton builder scene, I can copy the animation player and then I want to right click and save branch as scene so I can edit just the animation player in the text editor. So I'll rename this to Mixamo animation player. As you can see, the animation currently does not affect the skeleton, but since I saved it as a scene, I can open the Mixamo animation player with a text editor, and then I'll search for the path human rig / skeleton 3D, and I'll replace that with hybrid skeleton and replace all. Then save and reload the scene. And now you can see that the animation is mapped to the 3D character. So the body still works. And you can see that the head animations still work as well. then you'll want to animate the face as well, and you'll probably want to use an animation tree for this, but I still don't really know how those work, so I'll just use a second animation player. So the thing is, you can only play one animation at a time with a single animation player, but you can have multiples, or you can just use the animation tree to play the animation simultaneously. So I will have to learn about that at some point. So now if I make a new animation for the blink, and I go to the skeleton, so the orbicularis is the eyelid top and bottom, so it's open by default, so I want to set a keyframe and create the reset track at the beginning of the animation, and then halfway through I'll make the eyes close, so you can just change the Z. You can see the eyelid is opening and closing, and the Y does a similar thing, so it might be a combination of those, but for now I'll just set the Z rotation to 0.44, and now the eyelid is closed, so I'll set the keyframe here for the rotation. But now if I click away, you can see the rotation changes to 0 because it's relative now for some reason, and you can see that the eye is not changing at all. And if I play this, it tells me that the rotation track contains unnormalized quaternions. So I'll start again with the empty blink animation and select the hybrid skeleton and toggle the edit mode so you have selectable points on all the bones, and then you can move them. And then I'll find the eye and add a new keyframe for the orbicularis rotation, create the reset track, and then you can just use the editor to close the eye. So that looks pretty good, and then you'll want to insert key for existing tracks. So now if I hide the skeleton, you can see the eyelid is opening and closing. So I'll just duplicate the key, and now the character is winking. And to do the other eye, I'll just select the left eye in the skeleton and add the initial rotation. Then I can use the arrows to close this eye as well, and it's not going to be perfectly symmetrical, I don't think, but we'll try to get it as close to negative 0.58 as I can. So there we go. Now it should be the same. And then I'll add that keyframe and duplicate the original. if I can get it to, oh, it duplicates it at where the cursor is. Okay, so duplicate the open. So now when I play this, the eyes blink open and close. And of course, you can do more complicated animations. So if you wanted to make the character smile, you would rotate the levitors. So you'll want to tilt the end out and then something like that. And then if you wanted to, so you can see they're smiling more or less. And then if you wanted to make them laughing, you could open the jaw to make a laugh animation, and play the blink as well. So this is extremely tedious, as you can see, and not particularly consistent. And you'll probably want to use inverse kinematics somehow, so I know most tools use that to keep the proportions correct, but that's something that I'll look into another time. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching and have a great day.